Chapter 13 is looking at the rise of mass democracy during the Jacksonian era from 1824 to 1840. Now, to begin, the election of 1824, remember this is still technically during the era of good feeling. So 4 candidates emerged in the 1824 election, all of whom identified themselves as Republicans or Democratic Republicans, as we've talked about before. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson, all vying to be the president in 1824. The difference here is that each of these 4 candidates, there are some major differences. So we're starting to see a split within the political party and the formation of new parties. The reality was, even though Andrew Jackson was the winner of the popular vote, he did not have enough electoral votes in order to be declared the winner. So the election was thrown to the House of Representatives. And remember, the House of Representatives is where each of the states gets 1 vote. So all the members from Massachusetts vote as 1, all of the members of North Carolina vote as 1, whatever. The problem is the top 3 vote getters were sent to the House. The 4th was left off. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford. By this point, William Crawford had had a stroke, so he was essentially out of the running. The one who was left off the list, or the one who came in 4th, was Henry Clay. The problem is that Henry Clay, though, was the Speaker of the House. And he absolutely despised Andrew Jackson. He saw him as competition for the Western vote because both of them were from the West. And he saw him as competition for the vote of the common man because Andrew Jackson absolutely presented himself as the candidate for the common man. So in the end, and nobody is 100% sure how this happened, but John Quincy Adams was named the winner of the election of 1824. And after John Quincy Adams won the election of 1824, he turned around and named Henry Clay his Secretary of State, which at this point kind of meant you were next in line to run for president. So from Jackson's perspective, he declared this to be a corrupt bargain. He felt that there had been some sort of secret agreement between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams to hand John Quincy Adams the election in exchange for Henry Clay being named Secretary of State. There is no direct proof that this actually happened, but it is a rallying cry for the next election of 1828. So the minute Andrew Jackson lost the election of 1824, he essentially started running for president for the next term. So John Quincy Adams' 1 term in office had some major issues because there was a major opposition against him. So in 1828, this is where specifically the Republican Party 100% split. No longer just one party. Now we see the National Republicans, and they're not going to be around for very long, with John Quincy Adams as their candidate. Now remember, he is the sitting president at this time, versus Andrew Jackson. And this is where we see the modern-day Democratic Party formed. Andrew Jackson is considered the founder of the modern-day Democratic Party. Now, the election of 1828 was filled with mudslinging, was filled with half-truths or complete lies altogether. We have this perception in our mind that old elections used to be very fair and very gentlemanly. That was absolutely not the case. Andrew Jackson's wife was called a bigamist, which I guess technically she was since she hadn't actually divorced her first husband before marrying Jackson. Adams' supporters called Jackson's mother a whore. He was denounced for the number of duels that he had been in, which was true. John Quincy Adams was called corrupt for that corrupt bargain, and he was basically called the pimp for the Russian Tsar from a trip when the Russian Tsar came here. All of this happening in the newspapers of the day. So in the end, John Quincy Adams lost the election, only actually winning New England. Now once again, we know that the power base is shifting away from New England towards the South and the West, particularly the West, as more and more southern states are carved out of the territories and given power. This is absolutely the rise of the common man, or modern democracy, where the common man participates, which is exactly what Andrew Jackson was going for. Here are pictures of the two, Andrew Jackson on the left, John Quincy Adams on the right, and this is from the newspapers of the day denouncing Jackson for the number of duels he had been in. Now, after John Quincy Adams was named President of the United States, he instituted what's known as the spoil system. This is extremely, extremely important. We are going to be talking about the spoil system for years and years to come. It's also known as the patronage system or cronyism. A crony is your friend, your best dude, your right-hand man that you go to. So from Jackson's perspective, he was all about the common man. He felt that the common man could absolutely run the government and participate in the government on a more regular basis. So from his perspective, he has just won this election. Why shouldn't he give his loyal Democratic followers jobs in the federal government? Now, this is not referring to elected positions. Elected positions are elected positions. But there are thousands of people who work for the federal government. They are the bureaucracy or the infrastructure, the day-to-day runnings of the federal government. Those are appointed positions that, make a salary. So from Jackson's perspective, going back to this old adage, to the victor go the spoils of war. The spoils of war was all of the treasure that soldiers used to get when they would ransack a town. They would steal everyone's stuff, take their spoils or their treasure. So from Jackson's perspective, he has just won this major quote-unquote war. He has just won. Why shouldn't loyal Democrats be given the spoils of war, aka jobs in the political government? Also, Jackson felt that we didn't need an aristocratic bureaucracy. We didn't need the wealthy to govern society, that this is something that the common man could do. So why not bring in some new blood? Why not hire loyal Democrats to do this job? It's not that difficult, he said. So this is essentially the Founding Fathers' worst nightmare. What they had worried about the creation of political parties, that people would not focus on doing what's best for the country, they would instead focus on party loyalty, is exactly what Jackson was creating. It's no longer what can you do for the United States, but what have you done for the party? This absolutely cements party loyalty. People become rabid about the Democratic Party, and then later on the other political parties to come, the Whigs, and then later the modern day Republicans, because it's all about political appointments. It's all about jobs that are available. Now, even though Jackson, it wasn't exactly that scandalous of an idea, what we do see as a result of the spoil system or cronyism, some scandalous appointments, that crooked people could buy themselves a job in the federal government by contributing enough money to the Democratic Party. One example of this was Samuel Swartwout in New York City. He was named customs collector for the port of New York City, which is obviously where a lot of money was coming in. This is the guy that collected tariffs. After 9 years in this position, he had skimmed enough money off the top, namely $1 million of the U.S. government's money, and ran away to Europe. So this is one example. But even with the spoils system, it did cement party loyalty, and sometimes even over the issue of sectionalism. So we are going to see, leading up to the Civil War, this issue of Democrats sticking together, whether they're Northern Democrats or Southern Democrats, and Whigs, which is a party we'll talk about in a second here, staying together, whether they're Northerners or Southerners, simply because of this issue of the spoils system. Here you see Jackson's inauguration, the common man coming out in full force. He absolutely welcomed common people coming into the White House whenever they wanted. Now, during Jackson's term in office, there has been a protectionist tariff for a while, since 1816 particularly. And what I mean by protectionist tariff, I mean a tariff that's not just focused on raising revenue, but a tariff that is focusing on protecting American industry. This absolutely helps the New England and the Middle States, because this is where the fledgling industry is starting to grow up, in New England and in the Middle States. So the industry in New England and the Middle States don't have to face as much competition from foreign governments, because the government is charging those foreign importers a tax on that imported good. So they have to then raise their price. This hurts southern and western farmers, because oftentimes what ends up happening is, if the United States charges a tariff against foreign governments, those foreign governments then turn around and charge what's known as a retaliatory tariff, a tariff on American goods being sold overseas. This primarily hurts agricultural products, because that's exactly what we are trying to sell overseas, namely cotton and things like that. So southern and western farmers felt like they were the ones being hurt in this deal with a growing tariff. Also, to add insult to injury, not just the retaliatory tariffs, but with a lack of competition because the tariff is being charged on foreign goods, this drives up the prices for consumer goods. So, for example, if a farmer wants to buy a steel plow to, grow his crops, he is probably going to buy an American-made steel plow because the price is cheaper than the British-made product. But that's only because the British-made product has been charged a tariff. If there was no tariff, the British product would be cheaper and the American product would have to be lower as well, thus driving down prices and helping the consumer. So by 1828, the tariff has continued to grow larger and larger and larger. Still, it's got a long way to go. We're going to talk about the one in the 1890s, which is extremely high. But from the Southern perspective, this is too much government interference. The government is getting too involved in our daily lives. And not only that, the farmer is the one being hurt with this whole tariff. So the tariff of 1828, the South called it a Yankee tariff, or the tariff of abominations. An abomination is something so terrible we can't even talk about it. That's how horrible it was to them. And not only that, but where else might the federal government start to interfere? Are they going to come after slavery next? This is going to be an issue leading up to the Civil War as well. So the vice president at this time under Andrew Jackson was named John C. Calhoun. He was a South Carolinian, and he secretly wrote a document that was adopted by the South Carolina state legislature known as the South Carolina Exposition. And what this document said was that this tariff of abominations was unconstitutional, and thus South Carolina was going to nullify it within their own borders. Now, as we've already talked about before, the states don't have this right. Marbury versus Madison put this issue to bed in 1803. It is not up to the states to decide if something is constitutional or not. That is the Supreme Court's job. But nonetheless, it didn't stop John C. Calhoun from proposing nullification again, just like we saw with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions before. So, 1832, the U.S. government tried to make some accommodations, but the tariff of 1832 was still too high from the Southerners' perspective. It was still too high of a tariff. So South Carolina adopted nullification, meaning they were refusing to acknowledge this tariff within their borders. Now, South Carolina is an importing state, so we're just not going to collect tariffs, they said. Andrew Jackson, who was president at this time, he didn't actually favor the tariff. He agreed that it was hurting farmers and whatnot. But what he was against was the state of South Carolina declaring that they weren't going to follow the federal government's law. He was against the proposed disunion that might come should the U.S. try to force the hand and whatnot. So Jackson was against these nullifiers, or the nullies as they were known. And he threatened to lead an army personally, march into South Carolina, and hang every nully that he saw on the way. Tensions are extremely high at this point. We are on the brink of civil war in the United States over a stupid tariff nonetheless. A compromise was absolutely needed. So Henry Clay steps in. Henry Clay was now a senator at this time. Henry Clay is known as the Great Compromiser, and we'll see some other compromises that he comes up with later. But he proposed a compromise tariff of 1833 to try to ease these tensions. And what this compromise tariff of 1833 said was that this tariff would be reduced 10% every single year until it got down to the original 1816 level. This was a compromise to help avoid civil war at this time. So even though Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson were mortal enemies at this point, Henry Clay did not want to see war break out over this. Congress also passed what's known as the Force Bill, which gave the president the authority to use the Army or the Navy at his discretion to collect any tariffs that he felt weren't being collected. Now, as almost a final slap in the face, South Carolina nullified the Force Bill, which is kind of, screw you to the U.S. government. Now, also during Jackson's term in office, he had to deal with Native Americans. The Democrats at this point, remember, they're all about the common man, specifically farmers out west. They wanted to focus on westward expansion. But the problem is they're running into Native Americans left and right. Now, since the days of George Washington, these tribes had been treated as separate nations, as separate entities. Separate treaties were signed with them just like we signed with France and Great Britain and whatnot. The reality was that these treaties were often violated and boundary lines were pushed anyway. Starting around the late 1700s, early 1800s, we see a movement to try to, quote, civilize or assimilate the Native Americans, to not necessarily get rid of Native Americans, but to make them more white or make them more in Americans' image by providing white education. This is going to be a common theme that we see later on as well. Some of the tribes actually took to this. We called these tribes the 5 civilized nations: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. These were the 5 civilized tribes. They owned property. They dressed oftentimes in Americanized styles, etc. And they created a tribal government very similar to the United States. Some Cherokee actually even owned slaves down south. The problem comes in when the state of Georgia decided that they wanted control of the Cherokee land. So the state of Georgia declared that the Cherokee Council was illegal, and thus the state of Georgia had the right to seize their land since the Cherokee were living within their state. This is basically a smokescreen for "we just want your land," essentially. The Cherokee, as one of the 5 civilized tribes in the United States at this time, did what any other white American would have done at this time. They sued the state of Georgia, and this court case was taken all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Worcester versus Georgia. 3 times the Cherokee took their court case to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, still headed by John Marshall, continuously sided on with the Cherokee in this court case. The Georgia had no right to seize control of the Cherokee's land. The problem is that Andrew Jackson, who is a Democrat, obviously, and who is in favor of westward expansion, and he has never been a friend to the Native Americans, as we saw during the Seminole Wars down south, very famously declared that John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. He was obviously siding with white settlement over the Cherokee. But why this is important is because Andrew Jackson is essentially denying the court case or the Supreme Court ruling in this and is refusing to uphold the law. Remember, the executive branch is supposed to enforce the law. And instead we enter into a period of time known as the Trail of Tears, not just relating to the Cherokee as they were forced out of Georgia and westward, but other forced migrations as well, namely from the Indian Removal Act of 1830, to transplant Native American tribes from east of the Mississippi west of the Mississippi River. They were told that the Oklahoma Territory, or Indian Territory as it was called then, would be theirs forever, free from white encroachment. And so on these forced migrations, 4,000 died during this Trail of Tears, forcing Native Americans from their native homelands east of the Mississippi out west to Oklahoma. Also in 1836, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created to deal with Native American tribes, and this is going to be a long-lasting issue for years to come.